Hello everyone, I'm bringing you the first in a series of videos today looking at the Canadian 1982 pattern equipment. Now this is obviously the successor to the 1964 pattern, comes into use progressively through the mid-1980s. It's quite an interesting set of equipment. It's got some quite interesting and fairly unique design features, and we're going to have a look at that as we progress through this series. In part one, what we're looking at is a basic set of equipment in fighting order. So this is the most stripped down set of equipment you could have, basically per the manual. Not suggesting this is necessarily set up to represent use in the field. This is taken from the 1983 manual. And one thing to note here is obviously there is no respirator gas mask protective mask included with this set of equipment. The protective mask carrier was not actually part of the initial issue of 1982 pattern. It doesn't appear in the 1983 manual. There is an errata sheet and it's actually noted as a future piece of equipment in the 1983 manual. So I haven't included it here. Obviously, earlier mask carriers, protective mask carriers, could be used with the equipment, carried on a separate shoulder strap as we've seen with the 1964 pattern. However, not part of this equipment. We will be looking at the 1982 pattern protective mask carrier, the MBC carrier, in future videos and future parts of this series, but I haven't included it here because it's not part of the initial issue of the equipment. This is all basically first issue components, and as I say, set up as fighting order per the manual. And that's how I decided to display these first of all. We'll be looking at sets of equipment set up for use in the field a little bit later in the series. This gives the opportunity to talk about some of the basic elements of the equipment. We'll be talking about them on the mannequin in part one, look at them in a bit more detail in part two, and then in future parts we'll look at other parts of the equipment and the equipment set up in different ways as well. So without further ado, getting into the nitty-gritty of what we're looking at here, the set of equipment itself. It is of course primarily made from nylon, so it's Canada's sort of answer to that transition during the Cold War from making web equipment out of cotton webbing to using nylon, and that's what we have here. Nylon has various advantages. Of course, it doesn't hold water weight in the same way that cotton does. It's somewhat easier to decontaminate, although that still remains a big problem. The main advantage of it is it doesn't hold water weight when it gets wet. It holds a lot less water in the material and therefore doesn't gain a lot of weight compared to cotton webbing when it is wet. In terms of the 1964 pattern which preceded it, it's a great improvement, I would say. As I say, not having used it obviously, but just from looking at it, you have ammunition pouches as part of the equipment, which I think, from what I've read, it was generally agreed to be an improvement compared to carrying the ammunition in the shirt coat or the smock, the jacket of the combat uniform. So return to ammunition pouches there. You have an ammunition pouch on each side here, as you can see, and these each carry 2 magazines for the C1, the Canadian version of the FN-FAL, of course, which was still in use in the early 1980s, and obviously in the mid-1980s there would be a transition to the C7, which is a derivative of the M16, and that would bring a change. That's another thing with this set of equipment. In contrast to the 1951 pattern, another earlier set of Canadian equipment, the pouches are not designed to be universal. So in the 1951 pattern, they're very large ammunition pouches, which will basically accommodate anything and everything that Canada was using or considering using at the time the equipment was introduced. In this instance, there are separate magazine pouches, separate ammunition cases for each type of weapon. So as we'll see in future parts in this series, there is also a magazine pouch for the SMG. I'm hoping I'll be able to show you some magazine pouches for the C2, the elongated 30-round magazines. I don't have a pair of those as yet, but hopefully I'll be able to show you that in the future at some point. The belt is interesting. It has a very interesting feature in terms of attaching the pouches onto the belt. It uses eyelets and plastic hooks on the back. This is somewhat similar to the system used by the Bundeswehr on their later camouflaged web equipment, which was introduced in the very end of the Cold War. It differs somewhat in the way the pouches are actually secured to the belt, and we'll have a look at that in detail in part two when we look at these various components laid out on the floor, laid out on the blanket, and looking at the various features in more detail. At the front here, of course, it has the buckle, and this can be adjusted in with a strap on each side, which is quite a neat feature of the design. It's quite wide as well. It's about 3 inches wide, this, so basically return to the 1908 pattern web belt in that regard, and the intention of this is to be able to share the load between the shoulders and the hips. So this is all based on experiments which have been carried on load carrying equipment in the preceding years, and the intention of the equipment was to share the load appropriately between the shoulders and the waist belt, and which rests on the hips. The yoke, or the suspenders themselves, as you can see here, they're quite heavily padded. Actually, the padding uses the same material as the combat uniform is made from. You then have the nylon strap coming over the top here. You have loops here where you could attach items onto the shoulder straps. You could attach the compass pouch on here, for example. And then you have a buckle here with a strap coming down which can be adjusted in. And the strap attaches to the back of the ammunition pouches using tabs here and plastic hooks. And then there's also a piece of Velcro which wraps around to help secure that. In this instance, I've also wrapped that around the loose end of the strap there just to hold it in place. So that's a look at the front of the mannequin here. Obviously, the suspenders there, the 2 ammunition pouches and the waist belt there, the details we can see of that. We'll start moving this around now and have a look at some of the other components of the equipment. Moving on to look at the right hand side of the equipment here, if I lift the arm out of the way, you can see we have the water bottle or canteen carrier round on the hip here. This attaches onto the belt in exactly the same manner as the ammunition pouches, using hooks and a Velcro belt loop on the back, and we'll see more detail of that in part 2, as I say. This contains the cup and water bottle or canteen, basically very similar to US practice. We'll have a look at that in part 2 as well. Initially, this was the design of canteen or water bottle used with the 1982 pattern, been modified later on, but obviously we're looking at initial issue components here. The water bottle carrier itself would also be modified with reinforcement around the middle section. On this example, being first issue, you don't yet have that. Quick release fastener there, as you can see, in common with the ammunition pouches, binding around the edge here, and interestingly, of course, it's actually shaped to fit over the top of the bottle there, as you can see, rather than having the bottle cap sticking out of the top, as had been the case with the previous carriers, which were basically patterned after US practice. So this is a departure from that preceding design. Obviously, the bottle is entirely covered by this cover. So that's the water bottle carried round on the hip there. Looking at the back here, there are a few more components to talk about. First of all, round on the hip, just carried on a belt loop over the belt, we have a pouch which contains not only the pocket knife, the C5 pocket knife, but also contains the knife, fork and spoon set as well, or it would do. I don't yet have a set of Canadian knife, fork and spoon, unfortunately, and a C5 is on the list as well. I just have another pocket knife in here for the minute. But this nevertheless illustrates the point. You have a separate carrier for those components. The clip together knife, fork and spoon set sits in a compartment at the back here which closes with Velcro or touch and close, and there's a little open compartment on the front here which contain the C5, and this is the position as dictated by the instructions in the manual for wearing this in fighting order to be worn round or carried round on this hip. In the middle here we have the utility pouch. Now, as mentioned in a recent video looking at mess tin pouches, this fulfills that role, is one of the roles it could fulfill, and it's shaped for that purpose. It's the right sort of size. But as had already been the case with the 1964 pattern equipment, this could also be used to carry the rain suit, so waterproofs basically, and other things as well. And certainly as the development of this equipment progressed, this was seen more and more as a large ammunition pouch and would be modified to better suit that purpose. And that's something we may well talk about if I get that far in terms of looking at this. Most of my interest remains in the 1980s, and some of these changes came in quite late 1980s and into the 90s. So we'll talk about that a little bit more going forward, no doubt, but I'm not exactly sure when that will be. Moving up onto the suspenders or the yoke here, you have the entrenching tool in its carrier. Now, this is an elongated version of the 3-way folding entrenching tool which the US had introduced with their Alice equipment, or well, the M1967 technically, but it became standard with the Alice equipment. And then, of course, it became something of a NATO standard. The Dutch introduced it, I believe the Germans introduced it, the British introduced it later on in the 1980s with PLCE. The Canadians did have a version very similar in size, which had a shorter carrier. I don't have one of these, unfortunately. It would be rather nice to have. But this is by far the most common to see, the elongated version with the cover necessarily elongated to take the longer version of the shovel. And we'll obviously have a look at this in detail in part 2. We'll get this out of the cover and have a look, as it really does form part of the equipment. So this is a move away from preceding designs. Previously, you'd basically had the American style folding pick and shovel, I think in the M1951 in American service, which was carried with both the 1951 pattern and also with the 1964 pattern. So you've had a move away to a more modern design of entrenching tool. And obviously interesting that the provision here is for carrying it up on the back when there's nothing else being carried on the back. Obviously, if you're carrying the large pack, the large field pack, which is part of this design, this has to be removed. But unless you're carrying that, unless you're in marching order, this is quite comfortably carried up on the back here, as you can see. One thing I would note here is that basically to convert this set of equipment from fighting order to battle order per the manual is the removal of the utility pouch from the back of the equipment here. This would then be placed inside the small field pack, which is basically equivalent to the US butt pack, the field pack from the US M1956 equipment, and that would be then carried on the back in its place. You have the utility pouch inside it and then that attached to the back of the belt in place of this. So that's something we'll look at in a future video, but just something I wanted to mention here. We will be looking at that field pack going forward. In this instance, the suspenders come down and attach directly onto the belt. You can actually see the plastic hooks poking through the eyelets here, which gives you something of an idea of how this works. Obviously, we'll see this in more detail in part 2. You can see the 2 straps coming down on each side of the utility pouch at the back there. So that's the back of the equipment. We'll move this round now and have a look at the left-hand side. Looking at the left-hand side of the equipment here, I'll just lift the arm out of the way so we can see a little bit more clearly. Obviously, we have the bayonet here carried in the frog round on the left hip. This is a British bayonet but serves as a placeholder for the bayonet for the C1, very similar of course. The frog is designed to take the scabbard with a stud, as you can see here, and this is basically achieved by having 2 loops of material with a slot in between which the stud fits into, and then this loops up and forms a belt loop, the correct size for the belt. It just slides on there. It's made of nylon but is basically the same as the preceding designs for carrying the C1 bayonet. And this is the prescribed position for it according to the manual of course, and it does make for an easy cross draw when ordered to fix bayonets. Otherwise the belt is devoid of equipment here, there's no pouch or anything on this side. In reality it's quite common to see that when the field pack, the small field pack was carried on the back of the belt, rather than the utility pouch being placed inside it, it would be moved round to here. And that means of course you have a greater carrying capacity on the belt, and then the protective mask carrier carried on its own set of straps would be slung underneath, obviously worn underneath the equipment, so if the equipment was taken off you still have your protective mask with you. And that sort of setup is something we're going to look at in a future video, talking more about this equipment in actual use as opposed to referring back to the manual, which is what I've done here in terms of putting together this fighting order. So that's the left hand side of the equipment there. So I hope you found it interesting looking at this. As I say, this is just part 1 in a series and we're looking at the fighting order set of equipment here per the manual, which we're going to have a look at in part 2. We'll have a look at the pages in the manual itself. And this is not in any way comprehensive. There are quite a few more components to have a look at. But as I say, in this first video, sort of as an introduction to the equipment, I thought it was worth looking at the fighting order per the manual, and in future videos we'll have a look at this setup more for use in the field and have a look at some of the components we haven't covered in this video. So part 2 for this will be coming out in the not too distant future, and that's basically looking at what we've looked at here in more detail, and then there will be future parts going forward talking about some of the other components and so forth. If you have found it interesting looking at this and you'd like to see the future parts in this series, or if you'd like to see the other content on the channel going forward in general, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you would like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. And as ever, a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel using those 2 methods. It really is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. And if you'd like to get in touch but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address down in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.